Hello and welcome to the Wheels Boy Chat Show, where we invite an interesting guest to talk about an interesting topic from here in the Chinese car market. The guest for today's video is none other than Mr. Mark Andrews, who has more than, or almost 15 years of experience as an automotive journalist here in China. Welcome, Mark.
Hello, good to be here.
Very good to have you. So the topic for this video is something actually that was provided by one of the commenters on one of our previous videos. So again, please be sure to comment and provide us with any topics or questions that you want answered regarding the Chinese market. We are paying attention, but one of our commenters said, do we think that Chinese cars are going to dominate the global market in, say, the next 20 to 50 years?
What a huge question.
What a huge question, yes. If I knew the answer to that question, if I could really predict that, I'd be much wealthier than I am.
Wouldn't we all? Yeah. What I would say is really up until this point, has any nation really ever dominated the world market when it comes to cars?
In the modern era?
Well,
No.
in any era, really.
Yeah. I mean, what's the closest? I was going to say that's interesting. I wanted to start with that as well. Like, what's the closest we can point to as a car manufacturing a country or whatever that actually seemed to have a really dominant role? The only one that comes to mind, and not to be, especially nationalistic, is the U.S., and that was the early age.
Yeah, I mean, that was really the beginnings of the car age. You're
Right.
looking, what, probably the 20s, 30s, those kind of times.
Yes, and then post-World War II, certainly the U.S. was a powerhouse, but pretty quickly,
Well,
European. How many U.S. cars were being sold in the European markets following World War II?
I don't think many after World War II.
Not many people buying them, right?
Yeah.
It was only until it wasn't too long, say a decade or so after the end of the war, that the manufacturing capacity of a lot of these countries started to get back on their feet.
Yeah.
And you had German manufacturers, and you had French and British manufacturers making cars. Some of them never ceased. And so I don't know if we've ever really truly had a globally dominant car company or country.
Yeah.
Even today, let's look at the Chinese market, right?
Yeah.
We've got American car companies like General Motors in particular is very successful here in the Chinese market.
Well, the only one that's successful.
The
really
only American.
The U.S. manufacturers, really.
Ford does fine, but and then Chrysler is, as is usually the case, a distant third. But then also Volkswagen.
Oh, Tesla. Oh, yeah. Tesla's killing the Chinese market.
Tesla is definitely
in more
doing
ways
very
than
well.
one.
Yes, Tesla is definitely doing very well in the Chinese market. But yeah, it's a very, right now, the Chinese market itself, even as these Chinese manufacturers get stronger and stronger, it is definitely very, very competitive and very global. Yeah.
Well, I mean, if we look back, people said the same things about the Japanese car industry, for example. That was going to dominate the world market. Yeah, sure enough, it dominates some areas.
Yes.
So you go to Southeast Asia or whatever, predominantly the cars are Japanese, and mainly Toyotas, actually. But they've never managed to dominate the world market completely. And I think it's really difficult to do that.
So with that in mind, and I think that's our answer, is that I don't think that there's ever going to be a time when a single country's manufacturers are ever able to dominate the global market. Even there's two things I want to talk about now, and one of them is I want to drill down to, let's talk about the Chinese market and where we think Chinese manufacturers will be in 20 to 50 years. And then also, what kind of impact, or how do EVs change the game? Let's talk about that as a global picture first for EVs, right? Is because of the impact that the development of EVs is going to have on the entire car industry and how that is going to shake things up. I think there's certainly going to be some car makers that simply do not make the transition to EV, even those that are poised financially or in terms of production capacity. Some of them aren't going to make it. And I'm not, again, I wish I could make predictions. Otherwise, if I could make accurate predictions, I would be very rich. But how do you think that's going to impact things?
Well, it's the Donald Rumsfeld known unknowns and
unknown unknowns. Yeah. The known unknowns, yeah.
So what we have with the EVs is a huge wholesale change of the car market. And I think, as you said, a lot of existing manufacturers are not going to make it. And the manufacturers that we're going to be talking about in the future are going to be companies that are today relatively small. I mean, look at Tesla today. Tesla 10 years ago were a very small company.
Yep.
Now, okay, they're still not huge, but they look like they're here to stay at least, which 10 years ago was not necessarily the case.
Even 5 years ago,
Yeah.
people were like, I don't think Tesla's going to make it.
Yeah.
And
there's going to be far more companies like that. And it's not just from China either. In the US, there's a whole load of new EV companies coming up. Less so in Europe, but certainly in the US, huge numbers.
For sure, for sure. I think it's going to be what I think that the EV market represents because it's not a blank slate, so to speak, but it is a big opportunity. I do think that's probably where a lot of Chinese car manufacturers are going to excel, is because the Chinese market, as people who pay attention to our channel will know, we do a lot of EV cars, and that's because there are a lot of them.
It's a huge market in China.
It's a huge market. So it represents an opportunity for them to really seize onto and to make inroads, as a lot of these more legacy car makers struggle or slowly turn the big ship towards that
precisely. I mean, until recently in China, who was there that was actually doing EVs other than Chinese companies? Tesla. That was it.
Basically.
Unless you want, the only real foreign car that was doing an EV was a Tesla. There were very few others. General Motors were doing a few. Volkswagen is just introducing their ID brand here.
The only thing they had before was the e-Levita.
Yeah, and a few others. They had some PHEVs, but nothing much. And it was very much just a conversion of an existing ICE car to either a PHEV or making it fully electric. And quite honestly, the tech was not exactly cutting edge.
Rudimentary. Well, so let's get to that other thing I was going to talk about, which is I want to drill down and talk about the Chinese market and say, do you think that 20 to 50 years from now, we are going to see the same market share being held by foreign manufacturers as it is now? Right now, I would say that the best-selling cars in China, best-selling car companies are Volkswagen, General Motors, and people say SAIC, but a lot of SAIC is
SAIC is mainly Volkswagen and Buick, isn't it?
Right. They make a lot of their sales or their production is making cars for foreign manufacturers. Exactly. So do we think the Chinese manufacturers are going to be dominant in the Chinese market at some point?
I think they will be, but it's not companies like SAIC, I don't think.
Yeah, well, something we talked about before, and you mentioned, was that the need for, what's the word for?
Consolidation.
Consolidation, thank you, is right now.
That's a huge need.
It's happening, but it's not happening quickly enough, I think.
Well, I started writing about cars in China in 2007.
Which is a long time ago by Chinese standards.
Supposedly, consolidation was just about to happen then.
Yes, yeah.
And we're still talking about it. It's just about to happen.
It's coming.
It's coming.
I wrote, the first time I came to China was in 2013, and I did an internship for an economic magazine here, and I wrote an article that compared the car market of modern China to the car market of the 19-teens in the US. And the thing that I talked about was the fact that there's so many car makers coming and going in the US, and in 1 year they had like 115 new ones. And it seems like the pace of new Chinese car companies, it's not quite what it was, but they don't seem to be dying off.
Well, I would say that from maybe about the mid-90s up until around about 2010, there was a huge number, and they did start dying off then. But then came along EVs, and it started all up again.
Right.
Just when it looked like things were actually getting a bit normalized, and the EVs came and shook it all up.
Right. And you did a review on our channel of the, oh my gosh, what's that?
Are we talking about the Innovate?
Innovate. We did the Innovate. And
it's now been renamed, the company, as well. It's got a new name, and I cannot remember what the name is. It's NO something.
Innovation. I don't know.
No, it's a little bit different. They've renamed it.
You talked about in your video about how the number of EV startups is starting to slow down just a little bit.
It seems to be, yes.
They seem to be thinning out, and it has to happen. I mean, that's what the market needs to do. It needs to get rid of the weaker companies, and then hopefully the ones that are stronger can be left over and actually succeed. But yeah, I think.
Well, I think we are beginning to see some stronger Chinese companies emerging amongst the EV companies from the startups.
Right.
And I think going forward, they are probably going to be the leaders that are going to dominate the market. And also, we saw pre-EVs well, not pre-EVs, because actually one of the companies I'm about to mention is really an EV company, BYD, but we saw a huge rise in BYD, Geely, and Great Wall.
Yes.
And those three companies have come to symbolize, sort of, in many ways, the future of pure Chinese brands rather than JVs.
Yes.
And their strength is primarily within their own brands. And that, going forward, along with a lot of the EV startups, I think is where the strength in China is going to lie.
I think you're right. I think that it's, again, hard to predict which ones are going to be the strongest competitors. And I can point to the ones that make the most cars now, but all it takes is a couple years of messing up, and the Chinese market will swallow you whole. Something was pointed out to me in the Chinese market, as we wrap up here, but in the Chinese market, the product cycle is so incredibly short. I mean, in other markets, development cycle, it's you're going from generation to generation at 2 to 3 years. I mean, full new generations of cars, which is a kind of breakneck pace where it's genuinely hard, I think, for these car manufacturers to make much of a profit when they're having to pour so much money into the next generation of car to keep up.
There was the story about the Cherry QQ, which dates back to, I think it came on the market in about 2003, if I'm not mistaken.
Which is just a teeny little
mini
EV sized
it was basically a copy of the Daewoo Matiz, which was sold in some markets as Chevrolet Spark.
Yeah, or the Aveo. It would have been a Aveo at that period.
I have no idea.
Spark is still sold in the U.S.
Right, but I think it was the first generation Chevrolet Spark, if I'm not mistaken. But yeah, it was.
Let us know in the comments below, please.
The car was originally a Daewoo Matiz, anyway.
Yes, for sure.
And I don't think it's ever been completely proven that it was a copy, but it was, GM did take legal action.
Right. Putting that aside.
But anyway, the story is Cherry made 50 RMB. That's about, what, less than $10 per car they sold profit of the Cherry QQ.
That's the kind of percentage that makes a big grocery store chains, they talk about making like 1%, 2% profit margins.
It's ridiculous.
That's crazy.
Yeah.
And that, again, that's why all the manufacturers make SUVs now.
Yeah.
Because that's where you can actually make money.
Yeah. And why you don't hear much about Cherry these days.
And unfortunately, why you don't get as much about Cherry these days, or the QQ. But it makes me think how much
they're reviving it.
Well, the success of the Mini EV would suggest that there's reason to believe people want to buy that. So maybe it'll be electric, I bet.
It is. They're reviving it as an electric car.
All right. Well, I would love to know how much they make on each Mini EV that they sell, but that is a question we will have to answer in a future video. Thank you very, very much for watching. Thank you, Mark, for joining us.
Thank you.
If you have any topics or questions you would like us to address, please be sure to put them in the comments below. As always, be sure to like, subscribe, and hit the bell, and find us on Facebook and Instagram. Links in the description. Thanks for watching.